I outed myself that I had been faking orgasms. And
your habenula was faking orgasms.
Yes, your habenula was, well, you were performing, and then your habenula was like, this is not working out.
Oh my gosh!
And so I was tired of failing at orgasms, and I told him. And that just opened up a whole new world of like...
I mean, whose failure is it when you don't have an orgasm, doctor?
I know. You're protecting your partner's habenula by acting not truthful. You're performing as a sexual being. It's kind of a whack-a-mole. Like if you're denying that about how you're feeling in this one domain of sex, then guess what? You're going to eat, or you're going to drink alcohol, or you're going to numb out in some other way, you know, or you're going to look for the next hit. You're going to look for the next lover. I think that there's just a whole other level of sex health that has not been accessed in any way because we are so busy performing either as porn stars or as people not telling our truth. There's so much inauthenticity in the sexual relationships with people.
What is the percentage of people who have faked orgasm?
For women, it's the majority.
Never thought this episode would go here. It kind of seems like the habenula is like this holy grail of mental wellness. Is that how you see it?
It's really becoming this like big revelation and groundbreaking information in science and medicine. Two areas I predict are going to explode. One is in depression, anxiety, the kind of like mood disorder area around habenula and treatments for that. And then the second one is going to be for addiction because we've now found the culprit.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you because you know she knows a thing or two. So now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown. She's gonna break it down.
Hi, I'm Mayim Bialik.
And I'm Jonathan Cohen.
And welcome to our breakdown. This is the place where we break things down so you don't have to. We're talking to Dr. Kyra Bobinet. She's an MD and a Master of Public Health. And she wrote this book called Unstoppable Brain, the new neuroscience that frees us from failure, eases our stress, and creates lasting change. So if you've ever thought about anything that has had a component of, am I going to fail? Am I going to get this right? Why can't I maintain a fitness routine? Why can't I keep up with my New Year's resolutions? Why can't I lose that 10 pounds? If you've ever thought any of those things, you have to listen to this episode. There's a part of the brain that I basically knew as a neuroanatomical marker. There's all this incredible new research that Dr. Bobinet is going to talk about that reveals that this teeny tiny half-centimeter region of your brain called the habenula is the base of monitoring motivation and processing failure. And it's possibly at the root of so many things that ail us.
I'm going to take it even one step further and say, you may not have even realized that you've set yourself up to feel like you failed. You may be like, I'm going to set out to achieve this new business venture, this new relationship. I'm going to start working out. And unconsciously, unbeknownst to you, you may be doing it in a way that is going to make you perceive any type of setback as a failure and thus reduce your motivation to keep going. She explains to us the new science of how to set yourself up to be successful, to increase your motivation, to make yourself happier. Also, dopamine fasting in order to achieve more.
Yeah, Dr. Bobinet also talks about the increasingly important role of understanding dopamine and the habenula, and also oxytocin. So she tells us about the science of how pleasure can both motivate us, but also can be a motivation killer if it's not framed in the right way. And she has this really, really incredible framework that she gives us, and it's called having an iterative mindset. And she's going to go through how to have an iterative mindset to basically accomplish anything. Start a business, have a successful relationship, get over addiction. And the notion is not that like we found the cure-all. The notion is that knowledge is your best friend, and understanding the habenula, understanding motivation, reward, and our perception of achievement and failure, even at things that we think we're doing great, like my to-do lists. She's going to explain how a different framing can literally make your brain unstoppable, hence the title of the book, Unstoppable Brain. I'd like to welcome to the breakdown Dr. Kyra Bobinet.
Break it down. So great to be here.
It's really exciting to have you here. I feel very motivated and I don't want to fail. So, I really enjoyed Unstoppable Brain. I'd like to think that I have an unstoppable brain, but one of the things that was really interesting is I saw a lot of my faulty or perhaps misplaced thought patterns really throughout the book.
Mhm.
You really kind of hone in on places that we either stop ourselves or we don't let ourselves kind of fully be ourselves. So, before we kind of get into that, I want to start with a super basic question. Who did you write this book for? Like, what was the impetus for saying this is a book that needs to be out there?
Yeah, so I've tried to change the behavior of millions of people in my career, and created interventions of all kinds of complexity or simplicity, trying to get at this problem of, I know what I should do, I just don't do it.
Mm.
And I wrote it for people who have that problem,
Mm.
which is almost everybody in every way.
I'm trying to think, is there anyone that doesn't have something, right?
Right.
Probably not.
Mhm.
Like, there's always got to be something.
Absolutely.
Like, if it's not weight, it's fitness. If it's not fitness, it's work. If it's not work, it's
Mhm.
relationships. Do you feel that there's sort of one general problem that society or even our culture is collectively experiencing that sort of also needs this wisdom?
Yeah, I think right now we've kind of run aground in overusing performance-based tools,
Mm.
and performing, and being performative. And that in particular, in this time in history, is lighting up the brain in massive amounts of mental health problems and physical health problems and that kind of thing. So I think that this is a right-hand turn. I like to say that there was a time in medicine before we knew about bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And we used leeches and we used like weird things and we had typhoid Mary and things like that. And so after we knew about bacteria, then we had antibiotics and this whole new era was ushered in of like how to treat that.
Let's go right into this performative notion
Mhm.
because this really hadn't occurred to me. And you lay it out really, really clearly. You say that performing as ourselves
Mhm.
instead of really understanding and then being ourselves is kind of the cause for what you would describe as the disease of failure, meaning
Mhm.
that we're all,
Mhm.
not that we're all failures, but this notion that we will fail or that we get stopped because of a fear of failure,
Mhm.
that the cause of that is this performative aspect.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, what does that look like? Because when I saw the list, I was actually, I made it into a list because I make everything into lists. When I looked at the things that literally can be performative, I'm
Mhm.
just going to list them.
Yes, please.
The list is New Year's resolutions.
Mhm.
And so for that one, I was like, okay, well, I usually get annoyed with New Year's resolutions. And I'm like, I don't really make them. So maybe I was onto something. Social media,
Mhm.
competitive sports,
Mhm.
fitness trends. And now I'm like, uh-oh. SMART goals, which is an acronym, which we can talk about in a bit,
Mhm.
dieting, habit routines. And now I'm thinking like, okay, Kyra's off her rocker. What do you mean habit routines? Then she went for the guttural to-do lists, like
Yes.
my favorite thing.
Yeah.
And then it expands out, lying, career goals, relationship goals. And I literally wrote in my document, can I strive for anything? So
You
all
can.
of these
Yeah.
are what you would describe as falling under this performative category. So what does
Mhm.
it look like if I'm performing instead of being?
Yeah, so performing basically uses a neural network that terminates in the area of disempowerment and extrinsic motivation.
Mm.
And so I'm doing it for you, or my mental model in myself is I'm doing it for myself, right? So we're already there. And those two neural networks do not cross over. They are completely separate and independent of each other. And the reason why that's important is that when I'm doing it for somebody else, not myself, first of all, it's a disconnected state. But also, it sets up my brain to be triggered by any non-expected result. So that becomes a failure. I become disappointed, frustrated, whatever the case may be, if I don't have that perfect expectation happen, which is most of the time. And so the performing basically sets up a failure field. The failure field triggers the brain in this new area of the brain that we're going to talk about, the Habenula, and then that's a setup. So you can use performing, the literature shows that you can use performing kind of tools short-term, for short-term goals, or for single simple tasks, but nothing complex, dynamic, reversible, those kinds of things.
And also, I just want to note, because of course, I'm sure that people, like, the first thing I thought of, and maybe other people are thinking this, like, but it works, right? Or like, I lost 50 pounds or whatever it is. But I think what you're talking about is there's a price. There's both a neurological price and kind of a neuropsychological price.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you can use it, you can use it if you know about the habenula.
Mm-hmm.
Because then when you have a disappointment or a discrepancy between what you thought was going to happen and what actually happened, then you know what to do. Right now in this history, we don't know what to do when things don't work out perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're lost and then we get demotivated. And that's this kind of like pervasive motivation loss. Even doom scrolling has been shown to trigger the habenula, result in motivation loss. So basically, every youth in America and around the world who is doom scrolling at night and also in the morning, like my kids, are basically disempowering themselves, causing motivation loss in the evenings and the mornings. And so then you get this kind of self-blame that sits on top of that, and depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff ensues.
If that's what it looks like to perform, right? And the notion also is, of course, you would say, like, I'm getting fit for myself. But in a lot of cases, it is about a metric, right? Or it's about, if I get to look like this, I'll have access to this person, this job, this opportunity, right? So that's the performative aspect. So the converse is being yourself. So in brief, what does that look like? Because for me, it looks like to-do lists and, like all the things that I do, having goals and like forming habits. Like that's the old way of thinking. What is this newer way?
Do you mind if I explore the to-do list?
Do it. Okay. Jonathan loves when people ask me questions.
Yeah. So how do you psychologically respond when you don't get to all your to-do list things? What is that like for you?
Well, it doesn't feel great. Literally before we started recording, I told you that I made a to-do list for my son because I had a list of chores that I actually needed him to do before he left the house. There's usually, there's shame. There's a feeling of why did I try in the first place? I've also read the book. So like, I'm sort of like, I'm piecing it together. But the practical question I have for you is, if I have a list of things that I need to get done, what is the better way to do them? What would it look like to be myself if I have a list of things I have to get done?
Yeah, it's about letting go of the performance and just saying, this is an aid, this is a tool. So reframing tends to be the sort of wise thing that people who do this right do. And so if you approached it as, this is a potential list that we will get to, or that my son might do, right? Because you can't control another human being, especially a teenager. Then the way you hold it seems to be the key, but the fact that you're having shame.
I angled it like this. I went like here.
And the fact that you're experiencing shame means that you're holding it in a way, that it becomes a sharp object.
Got it.
So then knowing where that sharp object, happens, anything can be helpful as a tool in performance. You can set a goal. You can say, I want to run a faster mile. You can do all these things. But if it becomes a sharp object at the end of the day, then you're harming yourself.
So that makes sense. We now have performative me versus just me trying to be me. And there's some more reframing to that. But I do want to talk about, before we get into the habenula in particular, when you talk about that we're constantly failing, and you talk about that our disease, or I like to call it dis-ease, our dis-ease is failure. What does that mean? Because like, obviously I think of like, are we failing as a country? Like, are we failing, because we're not being nice to our neighbors? What does this failure look like when you talk about it that way?
Long time ago, when I wrote my first book, I had run across this paper when I was writing the motivation chapter that failure lit up this new area that I'd never heard of called the habenula. And it was discovered in like the late 1800s, but in the last 20 years, it's exploding. And in that paper, it showed that. And then a different paper, it showed that when we think we fail, or when the habenula turns on, we lose motivation to keep trying something. So I was like, Reese's peanut butter and, and chocolate, kind of like it came together. And so then from that point forward, it was like, oh, we need to manage the failure, not the success. There's a paradox there because if you look at even behavioral economics, we're twice as sensitive to loss as gain. Like this is the source of the brain that is causing that sort of asymmetry of real pain and psychic pain when the habenula goes on. It's your worst situation. And then we just try to reach for anything to shut it up.
Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Quince.
Whenever I'm gearing up for my next trip, deciding what to pack is very stressful. Why is it stressful for me?
You've never packed all the things you need, ever.
I either overpack or underpack or completely forget things. I often don't even think about matching. It doesn't matter. It's
Socks,
just like,
who needs them?
But then I discovered Quince. It's my go-to for high-quality vacation essentials that you can pack for trips to come. Like premium European linen dresses, blouses, and shorts from $30, washable silk tops, premium luggage options, and so much more. The best part, all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And by partnering directly with top factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middle person and passes the savings on to us. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. We love that. Jonathan is a huge fan of Tell the People.
I got a fantastic Italian wool overcoat. I
Very
think I might have
stylish.
mentioned this in the past. I almost bought a wool overcoat and then we had this partnership and I saw this beautiful coat and I could not be happier with it.
Pack your bags with high-quality essentials from Quince. Go to quince.com/breakdown for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/breakdown to get free shipping and 365-day returns.
Quince.com/breakdown.
I love my cats so much. And I think it's safe to say I would do anything to keep them as happy and healthy as possible.
And today's episode is sponsored by the ASPCA Pet Health Insurance Program.
Your pet is part of your family and you want the best for them no matter what, but vet bills can really add up. That's why you should check out pet insurance. And with ASPCA Pet Health Insurance, you can focus on the care your pet deserves and cover what matters most. For many pet parents, summer is about making travel plans, like adventuring through national parks, visiting pet-friendly beaches, or road tripping across the country. Wherever your journeys take you and your furry friend, help protect them along the way with a plan from ASPCA Pet Health Insurance. The ASPCA Pet Health Insurance Program offers customizable accident and illness plans, making it easier for pet parents like you to help your pet get the care that they may need. The ASPCA Pet Health Insurance Program has been around for over 18 years. They've helped more than 600,000 pets in that time. They allow you to customize your plan, ensuring that your pet's plan is as unique as they are, because vet bills can really add up, especially when you're least expecting it. It's very simple. You use their app to submit a claim, which is so easy, and you'll receive reimbursement for eligible vet bills directly into your bank account. To explore coverage, visit aspcapetinsurance.com/break. That's aspcapetinsurance.com/break. Again, that's aspcapetinsurance.com/break. This is a paid advertisement. Insurance is underwritten by either Independence American Insurance Company or United States Fire Insurance Company and produced by PTZ Insurance Agency Limited. The ASPCA is not an insurer and is not engaged in the business of insurance.
I want to touch on something that was just said. We're twice as sensitive to loss as we are to gain. I don't think people really understand the impact of that. So I want to actually go back to the beginning of what you were just talking about in terms of failure.
Mm-hmm.
What I hear is that people are setting themselves up for failure. If they make a goal and they say, I need to do this because it's a part of my self-worth. I'm going to be able to lose weight and then I'm going to feel good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be able to get into this relationship because that means something. There's all these unconscious motivators or values that they're associating with the goal that they're putting up. And if they don't get that, then that's the setback. Can you frame a little bit about maybe the very challenging and dangerous situation that people are unknowingly putting themselves in without realizing it?
That's a really good way to put that. So they're playing with fire. I like to call it failure fires. If you had a fire in your house, you would put it out immediately. And myself as a clinician, a researcher, for many years did underappreciated how toxic failure or the thoughts of failure are. Now I see it as, that's the most important thing, not the setting of the goal. And again, just like the to-do list, it's how you hold it. If you hold a SMART goal even, in a way that's flexible, or reframing any failure along the way, then it doesn't become a sharp object. But most of the way that we're doing these things is very linear and very, win-lose and very all or nothing. And so that's the way it's being held currently. And I think that we can, now that this information is coming out to the public, then the public can do something more creative and more protective of themselves so they don't keep getting cut by this. And I really, failure is like a bad word, in our society. And so I, like many others, trying to help people, never wanted to mention it or never wanted to go there. Nothing's more of a bummer than when you're all excited, to change your world. And then somebody's saying, well, let's talk about failure. Let's talk about what you're going to do when this doesn't work out like you think.
I want to talk in particular about this magic habenula, because you describe it as a failure detector, meaning it detects failure.
Yep.
For lack of a better word, it lights up, if you're talking about scans. But it's a failure detector and it's a motivator killer. So, and it's this very, very tiny, tiny region. I only knew about the habenula because it was kind of a landmark in neuroanatomy, meaning when you're dissecting the brain, it's like, where's the habenula? Oh, it's right there. Like it was question like 12F, on like my midterm exam in neuroanatomy. So it's this tiny little region. Why don't you orient us a little bit? Because most people who've watched or listened to our podcast know some things about the limbic brain.
Yeah.
We talk about the amygdala. We talk about the thalamus as like a processing center. My thesis was about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So like these are words that people have heard. Orient us as to where this special little part of the brain is.
Yeah, so it's epithalamic. It's above the thalamus. And
epi's the fancy term that just means above.
Half a centimeter large. There's two of them, one on either side, but central in your brain. And it's connected to everything. It's connected to your prefrontal cortex, your reward pathway, your limbic system. It basically, and it's also in front of, interestingly enough, the pineal gland.
Oh, that's a big important
So,
one.
right? Because the pineal gland's like, go, and the habenula is like, stop.
The pineal gland is actually in yogic and Eastern practice is kind of what is related to the third eye center. So when you meditate in Kundalini yoga in particular, and you look, they say to close your eyes and look upward and towards your third eye, it's actually pineal gland activation is what, sort of the notion is. So I really like this idea of the pineal and the habenula as sort of, in opposition, as it were. And the research that you talk about in your book, has links for the habenula to depression, to anxiety, to addiction, to hunger, to sleep. A lot of the things that the hypothalamus also does. These are all kind of homeostatic mechanisms. Also connections to ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And this is a term we've talked about a little bit here, but I think is really important to mention. It kind of seems like the habenula is like this holy grail of mental wellness. Is that how you see it?
As far as I know, because, I was a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gal before this. I had created, mindfulness programs at work and things like that, because I was like, oh, it's the PFC, it's the rumination. That's what's causing the depression. And it really looks like this is the one. This is the locus. And there's an explosion of literature that is reproducing this in both rat animals and humans. And so, it really opens up the world. Again, I say, like, there's a world before bacteria, and now after. We're in that post-bacteria world where we can treat depression differently. Even some of the transmagnetic stuff that's going on, I think that can be helpful. Deep brain stimulation. Ketamine is also a really big. Since I published the book, there's been more evidence to support the ketamine absorbs into the habenula and cures the symptoms of depression, so treatment-resistant depression.
Right.
And so it's really becoming this like big revelation and groundbreaking information in science and medicine.
I'm still stuck in at the beginning. I really am. I'm just thinking about, making it tangible how people are unknowingly setting themselves up for triggering this system of their brain to help them not succeed.
That's right. And, we're careless right now because we don't know how consequential failure or its friends can be. And there's a lot of failure types. I started a list in the book, and I'm really interested in seeing what the public has to say about that and saying, oh, I fail this way. But there's kind of like, your brain has favorite ways to fail. And we did some research recently in our company on failure types across different segments.
Oh.
And some people who struggle the most with behavior change have a very strong signal around shoulding. And then people who are successful long-term and iterative, which we can get into, have more like I used to be type of failure type. So there's really kind of these groups of strategies and also the way that you neutralize failure and what you're dealing with around failure that are very specific to different populations and different people.
So I have the list of types of failure. I'm happy to go there. So what you describe is that the ways that it's more like the ways that people feel that they're failing, right? There's certain categories that people fall into. And one of them is all or nothing thinking. One of them is comparing. There's the I used to be able to. There's what you describe as pre-failing. Nothing works for me. Been there, done that. Imposter syndrome as a type of failure. And then shoulding. And, I've heard people say that we can't should all over people.
Yeah.
These are going to show up differently depending on what determines the kind of failure that you foresee for yourself, I guess is the question.
I don't know. What I would imagine hypothetically is that, the brain is very habitual. And so wherever you got that, in my family system, it was all or nothing was a big signal. And so I had to overcome that. And there's a lot of ways in which I lose power around things that I'm scared of and that I pre-fail too. And so, I think that maybe the audience can tell us, which of those are most prominent in kind of their brain habits of how they like to fail. What gets your goat?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just speaking for myself, I was very interested in pre-failing. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah. I think this is kind of the class of performance anxiety, things where you already have forecast that it's not going to work out for you. And so the Habenula is always looking around the corner and saying, is this going to be safe or not? Is this going to be okay or not? Is this going to work out for me or not? And so if we train ourselves to always listen to that voice, I can imagine that it becomes habitual to pause and to not approach, whatever it is we're supposed to be approaching. And for me, that creates procrastination. When I'm afraid to fail, I dally and I do all kinds of weird things. I clean, I do weird things. And so I think that is something that once you know explicitly that you're doing that and you're not just procrastinating, which is more of like a self-blame type of way of experiencing that, then you can say, oh, like my Habenula is telling me something that is not helpful, that is not, I need to push through that. I need to try something else. I need to reframe the inevitable failure into like, well, maybe not.
Talk about imposter syndrome a little bit. This is one of these terms that's kind of thrown around a lot. And I was pleased to see it in this context because, we tend to think of it as like, I don't belong here, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. So it's basically, you have a performing self, that is at the fore that kind of triggers the feeling of imposter. Because if we were fully ourselves all the time and showing up that way, there would be no problem. But, more higher performing people tend to be susceptible to imposter syndrome in the sense that they step into an environment and they feel like, well, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't, it shouldn't be me, that kind of thing. And that's a form of failure trigger to the Habenula. and then losing your motivation to keep trying. So there's that kind of anxiety that's produced by the habenula of like, this isn't working out for me. They're all just going to find out. It's kind of similar to pre-failing in that way that you're kind of future facing. And you're saying, they're going to find out, they're going to kick me out, they're going to, expose me, that kind of thing.
I want to talk about a little bit more about some of these performative tools that fail. Can you talk about what SMART goals are and what that acronym stands for?
Yeah. So SMART goals is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound.
That's literally all the most important things in life. Jonathan, would you agree?
100%.
So what is wrong with having specific, measurable, achievable? What's the R?
Realistic or something.
Realistic, time-bound. What's wrong with having goals like that?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because it seems like, oh, that's clarity.
Right.
Right? But the way that the clarity gets operated at over time is that you have this SMART goal, and if it doesn't happen exactly like that, which is most of the time, eventually it will fail. Eventually you'll need something different. Then, and the probability that your past self predicts perfectly what your future self is going to do and how it's going to work out for that person is very, very minuscule. So everything leads to failure. Everything, that ideal sets an ideal, and everything else the brain is noticing, well, that's not exactly specific. That's not exactly measurable. Like it has a criteria against which to fail. And so again, it's how you hold it. If you had SMART goals, but you had some additional instruction of, hey, if it doesn't work out exactly like this, that's normal. Don't freak out. It's okay. Just iterate. And that in my research has been the holy grail solution to the habenula, to everything that we're currently using becoming a sharp object for people.
Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by BetterHelp.
We all know that we're not supposed to compare our lives to others, but it's easier said than done. Try as I might, I'm guilty of this all the time. And social media plays a big part in wishing our lives looked like someone else's for many of us. Comparison is the thief of joy. It's very easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like someone has it all together on Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want, not what others have, so that you can start living your best life. I spend a lot of time in therapy talking about other people, and my therapist gently guides me back to, what do you want? What do you need? Let's focus on how your life can look more like what you want instead of trying to compare it to other people. So we spent a lot of time going over that because I need reminders. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. Switch at any time for no additional charge.
Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/break today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.
HELP.com/break. And I want to get to this notion of the iterative mindset. But I think, one of the areas that you talk about a lot is, one of the biggest moneymakers in our culture, which is health and fitness, and specifically weight loss.
Yeah.
And you talk about, kind of the trajectory of what it's like, not only to try and lose weight, but to keep weight off. What are people doing without even knowing that they're self-sabotaging that is causing this kind of cycle?
Yeah. So I like to think, you can use anything to lose weight. Performative tools, strict diets, a personal trainer, all that kind of stuff. But the key is does it last? And do you know what to do after the party's over? And so I started doing research on long-term weight loss and figuring out what's different about the people who achieve that long-term state. And to a person, the only thing they had in common is that they were iterating their way through. So even if they did, a boot camp, even if they did a yoga retreat, even if they did all these things, each one of those was almost like a tile in their iterations of what inspired them at that period of time to keep going or to really get into something. And their space in between those tiles was very, very small versus other people who are like, oh, I used to do yoga and now I don't do it anymore. And then failure, habenula loss. no motivation, then blaming self for motivation loss, all that stuff starts to be triggered off.
So the notion is not there's anything wrong with goals, right? The notion is not that there's anything wrong with wanting to get fit.
Right.
The idea is that the way we frame it and the way we execute it is actually the difference in getting your habenula to help you or to hinder you.
Right. Or the marketing, the current marketing of, lose this in 60 days or whatever the case may be, really hurts us because it sets that expectation that that's going to happen and that it's going to be permanent. And all that stuff just sets up the habenula to be like, yeah, right.
All right. So I'm going to ask a controversial question. A lot of people are taking drugs to lose weight. And Ozempic and what's the other one? Well, we don't need to name it. Manjaro. I don't remember. It sounds like a mountain. I don't know. So what's happening, and I live in Los Angeles, so this stuff is like, it's big news and it's kind of everywhere.
At the gas station.
Right. and what's happening is that it gets an immediate response, right? Meaning it's such a performative thing.
Yeah.
Are people who are using these methods, like, are they trying to hack the habenula? Is the habenula being bypassed? Is there a component of this where you might say that's performatively positive, but what's the long-term implications? What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, nobody's done that study yet, but I hope they do after hearing this interview, because my hypothesis is that it's got to touch the habenula. Habenula controls hedonic eating, it controls satiety. So if you have satiety as part of the main activation of this GLP-1, which, by the way, GLP-1s are a daughter molecule of oxytocin. And to me, from a public health perspective, that means that we don't have enough oxytocin in our social systems, in our society, to help people feel good. And they feel lonely and scared, and they feel like the only worth that they have is as a performer of some kind, whether it's in business or entertainment or those kinds of things. Online influencers. And so, yeah, it is a performative tool if held that way. But I also know for people who have really traumatic childhoods or things like that, where food is the only thing that can shut up their psychic pain from their habenula, having compassion for that situation, this could be kind of a way to provide a safety net, in an otherwise frustrating situation where they've blown through so many diets and they've really wrecked their metabolism set points and things like that. It really helps them to kind of have some hope, But I don't think that it's a long-term solution for most people for a lot of reasons. There's really questionable, and I think Peter Attia like opened my eyes to this, which is like muscle wasting. Like that's the number one thing for frailty and longevity. And so we're playing with fire in that way. So I do think that for people who are just stuck in a whirlpool, then can't get out, this is a good way to kind of fish them out of that despair. And then, and it also, because it also, has some side effects on lowering depression, I also think it's activating on the habenula. It's got to be.
So what is the iterative mindset?
So what I did is I had a large project for the largest retailer in the U.S., and their employees' health was the subject of the behavioral research. And upon looking at deep dive into their stories nationwide, there was this subset of people that changed their health, got off their medications, lost weight, got fit, that kind of thing. And in the face of the world's worst, social and economic pressures and time pressures. And they didn't know each other. And to a person, the only thing they had in common was that they had this iterative mindset. And the way that I pulled it out of the research is that they would iterate instead of fail.
What does that mean for people who are like, what is iterate?
Iteration is like versioning on your phone. Like version 15, 16, 17. It's a constant state of improvement through versioning through something. So
it's like leveling up?
It's leveling up is
that performative?
It might be a performative. But it is a natural point of like, if you get tired of something and you want variety and you want to kind of like see if you can challenge yourself, that's a really good thing to do. But in this case, what they would do is, for example, there was a woman who was addicted to Doritos. and she just couldn't get off of them. And what she did was that she would eat the whole bag every day at baseline. And then when she started changing her behavior iteratively, she would eat the whole bag except one chip, and then 2 chips and 3 chips until she was leaving every chip in the bag, taking one chip and licking off the flavoring, and then throwing the chip away. Because she had realized iteratively that like she was addicted to the chemicals of the cheese. And so that became, her path. Of course, if you post that online, people might try that. It may not work for them.
I would just lick all the cheese flavoring off, all the chips
I actually
every day.
remember doing that as a teenager. So everybody had their own path, and they got there through iteration. Like, does this work? Experimenting, tweaking things, tinkering with it, adapting it. If, they changed shifts, then they couldn't go to their normal gym. They moved, they got divorced, all those things. They iterated their way through so that they found their next thing. And that's what made them superpowered.
And so the iterative mindset, you're continuously improving. Here's the goal I have to reach.
I'll say you're continuously trying. You're figuring it, you're puzzling. You might be in the valley. You might be like, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to try this little thing. But the attitude, which is why it's a mindset, is that this is going to work out for me because I'm going to iterate my way through it. Iterators never fail is what I've noticed. And then the other thing that they do really well is that they, through iteration or even some self-talk, they neutralize the effects of failure. So these people were naturally kind of intuitively figuring out, hey, failure is not where it is. I'm going to unblock myself. Tomorrow's a new day. Whatever little mantra that they would tell themselves, or try it with a friend, try it with my mom, all those kinds of things were a way of getting past the failure.
So you have a clever acronym. I like acronyms. And it's for iterates, right? And it kind of goes through the iterative mindset and talks about all these different components. The components are inspiration, time, environment, reduce, add, togetherness, expectations, and swaps. So these are all different components of the iterative mindset, correct?
These are different sort of like creature innovations that I found in research that kind of group together into categories. So not everybody iterated with one variable or 3 variables or whatever, but in composite, this seems to be a pretty comprehensive palette of the ways in which humans are inventive.
So give me an example of inspiration.
The mantras. So, a mantra that neutralizes failure, such as tomorrow's a new day, or it didn't take me 1 day to get here, it's not going to take me 1 day to get out. Those kinds of things where they set their mind away from the failure.
Give me an example of time, where time comes into the iterative mindset.
Yeah, and this gets into like current thinking around habit design where, you stack habits, before I brush my teeth, I'm going to do this, or at bedtime, I'm going to do that.
Oh, you're supposed to meditate after you brush your teeth. Yeah.
You can't. Yeah, exactly. And you can move that meditation around because it might not go for you in the morning. It might go for you at night, like those kinds of things. So moving that variable time can be time of day. It could be before or after something, like the habit stacking example. It could be frequency, it could be intensity of the time. So those kinds of things.
And when we talk about environment, this is a place where I start thinking of kind of differences in, how culture distributes resources. Like there's so many components here, I think especially that are important in conversations we're having about equity and about equality. Where does environment come into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's powerful, right? If you go to, in Buddhism, there's this idea of Sangha, and that's like a mini environment. It's kind of, and people could go to religious ceremonies or religious activities, even neighborhood, that there's a social norming that goes whenever there's people around. But there's also the things on your desk. There's where you place things in your fridge. And, I think there's some real legitimacy to, kind of out of sight, out of mind, for things that are tempting and those kinds of things. And even, for me, if I have a sugar addiction. And so if I have a relapse, like let's say we go and we get ice cream at night and I just put it in the freezer and I forget about it or I throw it away, if my lower self kind of did something. So I kind of regulate my environment that way.
Mm-hmm. What about reducing and adding? This was actually really interesting to me because for me, when I think about wanting to expand or wanting to improve or try, it seems like it would always be adding, but reducing can be just as important.
Yeah, we find that like there's something in the brain called heuristics, right? Which is the way that you like to take shortcuts. Your fast brain, because we can't, cogitate on everything. So in reducing, that has to do with the people who, I'm at a 6, can soda, pace, and I'm going to go to 5. I'm going to go to 4.
Got it.
So just being able to kind of harm reduce, it's called in psychology, is kind of the variable of reducing things.
Okay. And then adding makes more sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about the importance of togetherness.
Yeah, nobody changes alone. In my research, it shows that nobody changes alone. They always have a buddy, or they have a group, or they have coworker. Usually spouse is number 1, and then followed by another family member or friend.
And what is it about that togetherness that kind of helps with iterative mindset?
It's kind of a microenvironment for social accountability and social support. I would say that accountability is very it can be very performative, so we got to be careful with that. But it is somebody else who's doing, people like me do things like this, per Seth Godin's definition of tribe. We're just so wired for social that it would be neglectful, and it's not successful if you don't have it.
Tell me about the expectations component of this mindset.
Yeah, so that's where we were getting into SMART goals earlier, where if you expect something to happen, it doesn't happen. You've got to do something about that. So reframing is the number one way that people neutralize failure that is kind of live in their system. When something didn't work out the way they thought, they tend to, change what they expected. Well, maybe, it'll take a little longer. Or maybe I didn't try that hard, or that kind of thing, to make it okay. Because if you leave that live like that, then it becomes a failure, a sharp object, and your Habenula's on.
And the final of this acronym, what about swaps? Give me an example of a couple good swaps that you can do.
Yeah, these are clever people, I mean, we have zoodles for noodles these days, and people who hack their sugar drink with stevia, like those honey, like those kinds of things are, neurosimilar, sensory similar, crunchy for crunchy. Salty for salty, sugar for sugar, sweet for sweet, that kind of thing is what people do. Even if you are, struggling with alcohol addiction, you go to a party and you have a non-alcoholic beer, but the whole sensory experience is otherwise the same. Like those are swaps that kind of trick the brain into thinking like, okay, we're all right. It's familiar.
On page 133 of your book, this is a very, very sexy heading. It says, the biggest mistake people make about habits. What is the biggest mistake that people make about habits?
Two things. One is that it is permanent, and that it is going to happen in 21 days, And so really understanding that habits is not a marketing term. It is a neuroplastic change that happens at about a year, firmly. And that it takes a year to construct that automatic way of being.
I don't want to hear that.
I know. It's super sad. It's super sad.
Well, it's super sad, but it also, what it does is it highlights a much larger concept that you are trying to communicate to people, which is that there is no quick fix. There are changes that can happen quickly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like if you stop using the drug that you are addicted to, right? You'll see some changes pretty quickly. You'll feel all the things that you were trying to unfeel when you were taking the drug. But the notion of having a different mindset, that is something that is a life commitment.
Yeah. And mindset moves faster than habits. So the good news is that if you work on your mindset, it's going to be very rewarding. It's going to be, the opposite of depression is not happiness.
Right.
It's getting rid of the failure. And, when people get mired down in depression they cannot get out of, it's because they have an active set of failure fires, wildfires that are going on in their being, and they can't figure out how to extinguish them.
What is depression in the framework of failure?
Depression is fed by failure. So if you don't have an idea or notion of failure anymore, whether it's because some people meditate and they kind of go to this, metacognitive state and they they can observe the brain, and other people do compassion practice, other people do service, leadership, other people, at workout, like whatever works for them. But there's a way to counteract the idea of failure in whatever area that you're failing. And we talked about at the beginning, there's different domains of life, right? So I might be succeeding at work, but I might be failing as a parent. And so we're just underappreciating how the parenting failing can cause depression.
And this is also a place where a lot of people misunderstand when someone is depressed, because what they'll say is, you have a beautiful house, you've got a great job, you have a husband that loves you or whatever, you have kids. And this is a place where, the kind of old thinking was, what do you have to be depressed about?
Right.
And for people who understand major depressive disorder, which is a distinction from I feel depressed,
right,
or it's a distinction from I, God forbid, lost a parent and I'm having appropriate reactions, which are called a depressive episode.
Yeah.
But when you talk about major depressive disorder, and this is sort of, I love to point out when people are using nomenclature in psychiatry that's inappropriate. If you have, quote, no reason to be depressed from an outside perspective and you are still depressed, chances are you probably need a lot of support because you likely have major depressive disorder. Right. I mean, that's like a sort of an armchair, analysis.
Yeah.
Is that there's an abstract notion of what should, allow people to feel depressed, which is completely arbitrary and inappropriate. But what you're talking about is if someone's personal meter for failure, right, is so out of whack. I mean, if their habenula is, exhausted, depleted, wrung out, no amount of external success will feel good.
No. And we're kind of at that, place in psychiatry where we're not, we honor the content, but we realize that the content can be secondary, and the chemical, even the neurochemical environment can be secondary. It can be just a neural network issue, an electrical problem, And so, this was no more illustrated than that case study that I cited in the book where there's this German woman and she has recalcitrant major depressive disorder. She's very suicidal and her husband's really worried about losing her. And then they did a deep brain stimulation of her habenula and boom, the husband's like, this is the woman I married. Like, she's back. So we didn't have to do therapy. We didn't have to make her happy. We didn't have to talk her out of her misery. We didn't have to do any of those things.
She had an electrical signaling problem.
She had an electrical
chemical problem also.
Exactly.
So deep brain stimulation, do you want to explain to the good folks what that is? It's, there's a few categories that we use DBS, deep brain stimulation for, but can you describe what deep brain stimulation would look like for the habenula?
Yeah. For me, it's nascent. It's just one point, but they're doing it more in animal models right now in terms of like being able to turn off certain areas of the brain. So a probe, you can do it other ways. Again, transmagnetic is really where you kind of do the same thing. You're sending like surge of magnetic energy and electrical energy to a particular area to change its activation level. And so if you're trying to turn off the habenula,
you basically overwhelm it.
Yeah. And we don't know, again, lateral, medial, both sides, we don't really know what's going to work. And I don't know the protocol that they used for that particular woman.
Yeah, I'm picturing, for deep brain stimulation, we first started hearing about it when I was in grad school, in the 1700s. And they were doing it for basal ganglia stimulation for Parkinson's. And they were able to see, people with active tremors and, that sort of Parkinsonian mask. And it literally was like, it would it would light up. It was, I think of it like a long acupuncture needle. Valerie was like, are there side effects? Yes. It's like a probe in your brain.
Yeah.
So you have to be extremely precise. Like it's a whole mapping thing, which is why, they're not doing it a ton. Yes, it is invasive, but really fascinating.
Yeah.
So when we think about dieting, when we think about fitness, in some ways, I feel like when you look at the list of the performative tools, that are bound to fail, my to-do lists went in the garbage. Our experience on social media, New Year's resolutions, places in relationships where we have goals. I guess the question is there anything that we can strive for in a healthy way? And is that where the iterative mindset comes in?
Yeah. So, in my research on thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, the key around the habenula, or to keep it quiet, because you don't want to poke the bear, is iteration. And this is something I first saw at Stanford. We had a panel of expert patients who were leaders in their disease area, whether it was liver cancer or heart disease or diabetes. And to a person, they were all kind of iterating through their disease to really inspire other people who were having trouble. Where we go wrong on social media is that you follow an influencer and you take verbatim their workout routine or what I eat in a day or whatever, for models or whatever that is. And that becomes performative, as opposed to understanding the pattern that, hey, that person is iterating on how they're using smoothies or how they're, getting their heart rate up or whatever, and being able to say, like, what would it be for me to iterate my way through that? And that's an empowered state, as opposed to a disempowered somebody else. I'm trying to be somebody else. I'm trying to be this influencer, or I'm trying to not be myself. And so that seems to be the key to keeping somebody safe from their habenula and keeping the habenula happy and quiet.
Well, also, I can't help but point out that, almost all of those things that you just mentioned are a predominant feature of being a teenager.
Absolutely.
Being a young person.
Absolutely.
And, and I would also argue, like, we have a little bit of an extended adolescence, I think. My son tells me every generation thinks that about the next generation, but I really think it about this one. There just seems to be a little bit of an extended, kind of period of uncertainty and, kind of trying to find your way and being very, very impressionable. So how do we navigate, either having kids or, ourselves feeling like we're impressionable? Like, how do you navigate that when that is also a feature of development?
I did one thing right as a mother, which is that I taught my children, the number one rule of life is change. And the number one thing you can do is figure it out. And I didn't even realize my own future self would find iterative mindset and that this was actually a thing. So I think that the safest safety rep, safety vest, whatever you want to say, for teenagers and for all of us is to teach them to iterate. Carol Dweck's early work divided the world into performance mindsets and learning mindsets. And then she went down the rabbit hole of growth mindset from there. And growth mindset is essential, but it's not sufficient to undo the barrage of what's coming at our young people. And so I would argue that iterative mindset is, at least in my 30 years of researching all this stuff, the most protective factor that you could give a young person or an older person to navigate this world of failure triggers that we're immersed in.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about addiction. You touch on it here and there in the book, but I wonder if you can kind of lean into it a little bit more, because this is one of those things, I'm thinking about people who are chronic relapsers, right? Which is a very special category. Okay, so
on sugar.
There are chronic relapsers, and obviously sugar can have significant consequences, but I also think about people who, see their lives crash, lose their homes, lose their money, lose their spouses, their job, their kids, lose their entire way of being, get clean, and still will relapse, right? And the notion is, you think like, oh, once someone's hit bottom, right? You want to believe that's the bottom. But I wonder if you can speak to sort of what might be going on in the habenula and what are some of the, kind of deeper ways that we can understand the addictive process in this framework.
Yeah. So before people started looking at the habenula, there was this, addiction medicine 2.0 kind of idea where, like, if you have a number line and you have the person try to get pleasure, through their addictive substance, they'll go 1 point to the positive for the moment. And then again, loss is twice as powerful as gain. You get 2 marks negative on the number line. So now you're at -1. Then you try to get back to homeostasis at 0, and then you get punished -2. So now what's coming out is that the habenula is the source of that -2 for every 1 step towards something pleasurable. And that's why doctors are recommending or playing with dopamine fasting. because there's no other way. You can't get there through happiness. You have to get there through managing the failure, through managing the negativity. And a habenula that's on, all I can say is like it's such a psychically itchy state that there is a natural proclivity for us to numb out, to distract, to do anything to get that, because it's got a stranglehold on our dopamine. It controls serotonin. It has the most nicotinic receptors of anywhere, So there's a lot of operants in the habenula and addiction. And there was one study where they had young men who unfortunately lost their lives to overdose of heroin. And they found that their habenula was shrunken down. So you could imagine like that repeated, a wash of the addictive substance kind of suppressing the habenula and the habenula stopping you from doing something maybe wrong for you or threatening to you. Just their brakes went out in their car and they drove over the cliff, because they didn't have habenula brakes anymore. And so, it's very consequential. I think that two areas I predict are going to explode. One is in depression, anxiety, the kind of like mood disorder area around habenula and treatments for that. And then the second one is going to be for addiction, because we've now found the culprit for something that we've observed in people's lives,
I want you to talk a little bit more about this notion of dopamine. This is a very hot chemical, and we obviously, it comes up here a lot. But you said something about, kind of why dopamine fasts are recommended. I wonder can you explain a little bit more that pleasure is not kind of what will get you there. It's being able to modulate kind of the distribution of pleasure.
Yeah. If anybody's known somebody who really struggles with addiction, what they'll say is, I'm not trying to get high, I'm trying to feel normal. So they're trying to get back to that 0 point on the number line, that equilibrium, and they can't because they're slipping further and further at, to your point around like hitting rock bottom. That's when you've tried so many times to get back to the 0 on the number line and slipped further and further away from it because of this +1 - 2 equation. And so in terms of, the habenula and what it's doing to you, you're trying to shut it up with the addictive substance. The addictive substance at one point, I think, just gets rid of your habenular activity whatsoever because you won, right? But then you're a fiend for that dopamine and you're not able to feel that high. And so the current thinking is that if you just stop pursuing the pleasure, it's called withdrawal. And the habenula is the cause of withdrawal symptoms.
It's nasty.
It's a nasty little half-centimeter thing.
Yeah.
I went to Fez once, and there was camels with like little rings in their nose. So there's this giant animal, and it's led around by this ring in their nose. So I'm almost thinking that the habenula is kind of like the ring in our nose that we can be led around by, whether it's by other people or addictive substances. And so, this psychic pain is just like itchy and it's whatever, and like, shut it up. And so if somebody can get through that I think a month-long real painful period, then they can start getting some of their homeostasis back. They can get some of their like normal dopamine and normalcy.
Can we talk a little bit about how it can influence people who just feel generally stuck? There are so many more people out there these days that just kind of feel numb. They have this malaise about themselves and about the world around them, and they're just stop really enjoying things. They kind of are going through life in a bit of a fog, and maybe it's endless scrolling. Maybe it's just feeling overwhelmed by the news. But more and more people are, not excited by things that either used to bring them excitement or that decades ago, before we were endlessly connected, people would go outside and play. And, there used to be more of a sense of, oh, I'm just going to enjoy, quote unquote, the simple things.
So whenever somebody is in a state of anhedonia, that sort of state below or above depression, before depression sets in, that is by definition a habenula on state. Now that we know the habenula is the cause of that. And so when that's on, again, it's an itchy experience. And then there is a natural proclivity towards reaching for something to numb or something to entertain or something to distract. And so that's basically the loop that you're describing. And so the answer off the merry-go-round is to iterate your way out of that. Dopamine fasting is an iteration. I don't think it is important in all cases. There's weird people who can cold turkey themselves when they kind of wake up to, oh, that's not working out for me. I'm just going to cold turkey,
Is that the dopamine fast that you say, I'm not going to get a dopamine hit from this anymore?
Those people, I don't even know. They're freaks of nature. It's a permanent dopamine fast for that. And maybe they their addictive mind goes to another domain. Nobody's, I think, really articulated that I know of. But I would assume that's what's happening. But yeah, they just quit smoking one day because something clicked, and they're like, it's not going to do this anymore. And those kinds of kind of miracles of behavior change. But for everybody else, being able to do harm reduction, dopamine fasting, that kind of stuff, even the GLP-1s is kind of like inducing that, where you're not able to get the pleasure out of the food and all that yummy, all that kind of stuff is not going on because it's kind of stopping you. And it's giving you that pleasure in a way, or that need for pleasure downstream of oxytocin, that satisfaction, that satiety, and then also dampening your anhedonia, your depression at the same time. So it's replacing something that's been lost by your own spinning in the way that you're living your life.
So the question I have, because if we're looking at the Habenula sort of overseeing a variety of different, aspects of motivation and of notions of failure, does that put a different lens on, let's say, fitness goals and weight loss? Do we get to look at it in the framework of not just the addiction to food that might be driving you to, let's say, be a compulsive overeater, but the notion is that we become addicted to this process, right? Where basically our Habenula is so depleted, deprived, compromised, right? That we have created an addiction of trying to fix an addiction.
That's right. Yeah, you're kind of adding insult to injury, when you're reaching for the wrong thing. So it's the wrong view. When we have Habenula activity, and this is something this is my edge right now, is when I see myself not motivated to do the thing that I should do for myself. What is different about me, because I have a jump on this information, is I start looking for, where did I think I failed? And then dealing with that. Because it's not going to come through distraction or numbing or pursuing pleasure or, aversion of any kind.
But this takes a long time, and people don't want that. They want the fast,
That is fast, though.
Yeah.
I think it's equally as fast to really spend your energy being like, oh, this isn't working out for me, really reframing that. It's just that we don't have the right instruction right now.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to say that people don't want it, but in our fast-paced culture where, we're kind of scrolling all day and looking at the puppies blowing bubbles, that's a lot of where a lot of our energy goes, or we're trying to escape from the realities of politics and the world and just everything is crazy. This is hard for people.
Also, we're not taught to think about, hey, where did I think I've failed? And finding that psychological trap that we may have set for ourselves. What we're taught is, I'm going to focus on all my strengths. And if I just focus enough on my strengths, that's what's going to help me get over the next hump. But actually going backwards and auditing, that is a really powerful practice to say, where have I tricked myself into thinking or set up an expectation for myself that I haven't met?
Yeah, in my research, I saw two groups of people. One is that they would go and look at the why. Why did this happen? That tends to be me. Maybe overeducated people do that more often. But then there was another group of people that just, okay, that's broken. I'm just going to iterate. Not going to think about it. Generally men, And so there's a couple ways.
Say more.
They just start they go into problem solving mode and they iterate.
Oh.
Whenever they are not getting what they...
My ex-husband did this. He's very successful at certain things. Because he's just I'm just going to figure it out and I'm going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So if I see myself watching too many puppies with blowing bubbles, then stop. I iterate. I just iterate on what is going to cause me to, right size that in my life. And I
so you have to recognize the problem, right?
I see that there's something I don't want, and there's something I do want. And then, certain people are just like, I'm just going to start puzzling over here. I don't have to like analyze why this other thing is happening. I don't have to get all caught up in that.
I had been off news. Like I had been, I had to do a news fast. It was specifically really bad for, call me whatever you want. I'm a highly sensitive person, like all the things, like, yeah. So I had gone on a fast, and then, things happen, and then you come off the fast. But I realized I was having reactions that were pervading my day, midday, and night.
Like what?
Specifically, if I would wake up and the first thing I would go to was to check the news, I would feel my heart start racing, and I would feel like I'm putting all these chemicals of, and legitimate chemicals, meaning I'm outraged, I'm scared, I'm sad, like whatever those feelings are, but I'm putting them in my brain first thing in the morning and then expecting to not feel grumpy or out of sorts, right? And also I would then send things to Valerie or Jonathan, like, look what I saw in the news. I was sharing the trauma, right? I'm making everyone else feel trauma with me. And one of the things that I did, which, I'm already judging it, like I'm not entirely pleased with the solution, but I started playing word games instead. Meaning I really love like crossword puzzles, and I got into Wordle like 10 years after everyone else did. And I started like doing easy Sudoku because I knew that my brain wanted to chew on something, but I gave it something that wasn't as, I don't know, hurtful.
That's a swap.
I did a swap.
You did a swap?
I did a swap.
Yes, you
did. I want to do all of them.
Yeah. So you noticed,
right.
The thing that was kind of causing you more and more suffering.
Right.
And by the way, exposing your brain to the news, which is, I think it should be called the bad news because it's a misnomer. It sets up expectations that there's something, positive or helpful.
Right.
And then you're awash and your Habenula's on. And it's not—
My Habenula's always on.
It's not the problem of like taking in information for which you have a compassionate response. That's not the problem. The problem is that you have no way to do anything about it.
Well, and there may be some people for whom they don't have that specific response. Like my dad used to read the New York Times every single day.
Yeah.
Every day of my health, every day of my life, my dad would sit down and like you didn't interrupt him, or like I learned to like read the newspaper with him, which was like my hands would get all, the print on them. But like that was a thing. And sometimes he'd get upset about things, but like mostly he just seemed to like read the paper. But I don't know if it's that the news has changed. I think it all changed with like the political situation where like everybody, like where it was on Twitter and like I have to know what the president is tweeting while he's sitting on the toilet, like things like that, it just became so much a part of our constant culture.
Well, news used to be more boring because it wasn't monetized. And so once it became monetized and also competitive with outrage, with things like social media and stuff like that, then it did become supercharged.
Right.
It's supercharged. The language, I'm sure if you pulled archives, the language was a lot more straightforward and bland in terms of what your dad's brain was drinking in every day.
What I'm hearing about Mayim's experience is it's less important and maybe even counterproductive for her to go through a whole evaluative process of why am I being drawn to the news and what in my past is making me want to chew on something right now, and more important, to really quickly iterate on a solution to get her chewing on something that is less activated.
That's right. And my own, with New York Times specifically, my own iteration was to delete the app because I put friction in the way of, this is one of those ads, ad friction. I put friction in the way of between me and having to like type it into my browser, to get the fix. And, I also do a lot of solitaire game, just like non-open to social, just me, myself, and I doing solitaire. It's a soothing exercise. So I think that, there's productive ways to redirect that energy when you're feeling overloaded, especially for sensitive people like myself, yourself. There's a lot of iteration that needs to happen.
I wanted to talk about, and I guess this falls a little bit under inspiration from the iterative mindset. You mentioned something, and there's a couple points in this book that are that get very transcendental. You know,
Mhm,
you have
mhm.
indigenous lineage, and so there's some really beautiful kind of stories that you weave through, and traditions, and in some cases some ritual aspects that you weave through. You also do talk about the use of psychedelics. You talk about a particular, really kind of therapeutic journey that you took. But there was one section of the book that just it stuck out to me, not because it didn't belong. You talked about I am, which is soham in Sanskrit. And this is a mantra that is used. And there's actually one of my favorite in Kundalini yoga, there's a lot of songs that we listen to, and there's a lot of there's bands that just sing like Kundalini music. And one of my favorite pieces is just the words I am. And it's a beautiful piece. And it's like over and over, I am. And, we're all singing and we're swaying. But you talk about the significance of owning this notion of I am as part of shifting out of this failure mindset into the iterative mindset. Can you talk about I am?
Yeah. So, our ruminative brain, we have a narrative self within that. And so that's something, I'm telling myself right now that I'm on this podcast. You're telling yourself that you're my Bialik. There's a subconscious aspect of that that's going on at all times in terms of how we locate ourselves. And of course, with psychedelics, that's all scrambled. When the person is in a journey, the I am is kind of disorganized. It gives you a break, because what if your I am is I am the worst person on the planet? And so
how'd you know what mine was?
Sometimes not having an I am is good. But the main thing is that we do need to, with failure, kick out any notions of I am a failure. In some way transform those into I am learning, I am iterating, whatever it is that I am focused on, that I'm telling myself that I am, to re-identify with things that maybe other humans programmed us to think negatively about ourselves, or the world programmed us to think negatively about ourselves. And so that's something that is, unless we deal with the sort of chamber of the bank of I am and the narrative self, we're going to be kind of spinning.
Is this notion of I am, is this positive thinking, for lack of a better phrase?
I think optimists, if you look at the literature, optimism is a very protective factor. But just like growth mindset, I'm not, a failure. I'm not, it's not over for me. That is very essential, but it's not sufficient. And so I find that the iteration on top of that is really the operant part of getting out of any, destructive, negative aspects of notion of self.
I mean, I just want to hear more stories about people who, like the Dorito addict, had ways of successfully changing their behavior. It's fascinating.
Maybe we could throw out a couple. Would you mind if I threw out a couple scenarios?
Please, yeah.
Okay, Jonathan, why don't we throw out a couple scenarios?
Yeah, one that hit me was the procrastinator, or the person that assumes they're going to fail. How does that show up in relationships?
Yeah, so, in animal behavioral science, there's this kind of shortcut of approach avoid, right? And so the Habenula we've established is the avoid part of that equation. And so if I am wanting to be in love, or I'm wanting to approach my partner with something that's really vulnerable for me, or that kind of thing, then I may have a pre-failing notion of well, this didn't work out before. I was never received. I was never listened to, that kind of thing. I might hesitate, and my Habenula is already pre-failing me into not connecting.
That's avoidant attachment.
Yes.
You just defined avoidant attachment.
I feel like this is the answer to everything. Like you talked about Holy Grail. It's everything goes back to the Habenula, right? Because it is everywhere all at once, and all of our behavior. And so then if I don't do that, then I don't form a bond with my partner, then the relationship ends. So there's a lot of consequences in me not being able to wrestle with my Habenula and get it to quiet down.
So that, and again, I don't mean to throw avoidant attachment out there, but if
Bring it.
If you have this notion that I'm afraid to approach, And attempts are never going to be complete because there's always going to be that, habenula pulling you back, right? This then becomes a loop that's very difficult to break out of because you've just had reinforced that you will fail.
That's right.
So how do you hack that? If you are an avoidant attachment person, let's say because of your habenula, you can't just say like, sorry, it's my habenula. How do you hack that?
I hope people start saying things like that. I really do.
It's not me. It's my habenula.
I want this to enter the zeitgeist. So yeah, I think that iteration is the golden ticket to everything. I iterate. I might try like a little bit of a, maybe being more vulnerable in this moment. I might go to a support group for that. I might, read a book on that. Like those kinds of things are iterations. And everything is going to be different. Each person will be unlocked by a particular resource in a different way. And so, it's just about finding what it is that's going to turn off your habenula in particular.
I want to give an example about eating and food. You talk about it quite a bit in the book. In the category of overeating, I have decided, let's say I make the decision, I'm only going to have one helping, right? Like this is like a thing. I mean, the standard American diet is usually the portions are super large, but then like I always also will be like, well, I want seconds. So my notion, and it's part of its pleasure principle. If something's good, more of it is better. That's not always true, especially if you're trying to control your caloric intake. How do I hack that?
So the iterations for overeating that I've seen work for people is to, again, throw away the food as soon as possible, to split it and save it for later, to cancel their order if they ordered it, in a moment of weakness, to reducing the number of bites. And some people can kind of, and then if you also just blow past all of those gates of safety and you're just ravenous and you just, the inner monster has taken over, then as soon as possible, get out of the relapse. The people who succeed long-term.
Don't keep diving in and being like, I messed it up, I might as well keep going.
It's slippery, like you can just go all the way to the bottom of that. But people who are more experienced with themselves start to get better and better at pulling out of that tailspin faster and faster. And that tends to be built on iteration, but also their mindset they have right view, as they say in Buddhism, like they're seeing it clearly that, oh, I'm in a relapse and now I'm going to, dream my way out of this or I'm just going to forgive myself.
Here's another one. Some people, when they wake up in the middle of the night, go to the fridge. What? Not naming any names. What is that? How do you hack that?
So there may be a disempowered state of the habenula before bed. There may be a habit around going to the fridge, and so it's comfort, it's familiar. And so again, iterations for late night fridge is to have something as healthy as possible at the fore of that fridge and hide everything that the monster might, go after that would be counteractive for oneself. And just say like, this is satisfying. And also even, people do mindful eating. So if somebody has the presence of mind, not usually in a groggy, sleepy state, but again, making the good thing easy and the hard thing hard, or the bad thing hard, is kind of an adage that we have in behavioral design.
Okay, so we did a relationship example. We did some eating examples. Jonathan, Jonathan is very into like fitness and things like that. Why don't you give us a fitness challenge, like, something that's challenging in the fitness world that we could try and figure out a hack for?
Well, there's more fitness influencers on Instagram and elsewhere than I think maybe anything else. So if someone is trying to develop a new fitness routine, if they're trying to get over a hump or set a goal, what's the best way to be successful?
So iterations in fitness, as you mentioned, there's a plethora of information. The main thing is that, in trying those out, that they don't become sharp objects, because fitness can become so easily performative. But if you look at people, professional athletes—
When is it not performative?
I think when you're seeing the performance as the iteration. There's a meta there that I think that some super smart people are doing, and I hope other people copy that, not their workout. And so if I see a great inspiring workout, like there's kind of this notion of let's see in the self-talk world, like let's see if I can get myself to do this. Let's see what percent of this. Let's see how long I can get myself to do this for. But the expectation out from the get-go on every workout should be at one point this will fail me, bore me, and I will need to iterate, So if I go into it eyes wide open that way, then I will keep going where other people get caught up in I'm not doing Zumba anymore. Yeah.
That's interesting because I've noticed that Jonathan, who does look at Instagram and things like that, he'll sometimes get an idea for something and he'll be super into it. And I'm like, okay, this is his thing now.
Yeah.
But then it will run its course and he'll find another thing. And I find that very confusing because I'm a little bit binary about it. Like, what's your thing? Right. Well, it's like, I started doing Taekwondo and I worked my way up to a black belt. Now I have a black belt. And like, that's my thing. And now I work for my 2nd degree black belt, Whereas Jonathan is like, I hang from the ceiling on these things. And then like, I'll play pickleball. And then I want to pull a sled. He really wants to pull a sled through the backyard because he keeps seeing people pulling a sled. Then he keeps showing me this guy who runs on all fours. And I'm like, is this my life? Now he's going to start running on all fours. His limbs are so long. But like, that's kind of how it goes. And I think, for me, like, I am very performative, I mean, that's just, I think I was born that way even before I started being an actor. But I kind of feel like I've put my performative needs on him. Like, is he doing it to the degree that he wants? And then why is he stopping? Did he fail? Like, I'm all up in his performative Habenula business.
I think after this conversation, you're going to see the world differently.
I think so.
And I think you're going to see Jonathan differently. And I think you're going to see...
He's just one big Habenula waiting to fail.
I think you're going to see the sled as an iteration. I think you're going to see the animal flow as an iteration. I think you're going to see it differently. And then be supportive in a way that you probably can't even predict right now.
I haven't been supportive of my friend Jonathan because my Habenula's been compromised. I'm going to blame the Habenula for everything.
You're in the middle of a lifelong relationship with Taekwondo.
I thought you were going to say with my Habenula.
Yeah, well, also that. But the Taekwondo at some point will fail you.
Right.
It may be, in the last couple months of your life as an old, frail woman. Who knows, but everything expires.
Got it.
Yeah.
One thing I do with some of these exercises, I find also is that I will not do them exactly because I have a hip replacement. I'm always just sort of inching into things, seeing how much they impact me. Can I recover fast enough? And then I'm like, oh, so for me, it's research. I don't have a personal trainer. It's a lot of like, can I gather the information? Can I remember it? I get bored easily. And then I try to implement it. And then the other thing that I'm, hearing here, and I get stuck in a lot is like, oh, if I miss a week, if I miss 2 weeks, do I not get upset about the time that I lost and just say, okay, I can come back and reinforce the positivity of starting again that day and trying to build the next momentum that's going to carry me forward versus sitting in the momentum of not having done it to prevent me from actually getting back in.
That's right. And, that's where it could become a pointy object is in the week or two. You get sick, you're traveling, whatever the case may be, all kinds of life happens, right? And if you wallow or you interpret that as failure, watch out because your Habenula's on. And then you won't feel like doing it more. And then you're in this big, long relapse period, and so it's just about like, get back up, get back out there, do anything.
And I've seen that. I've seen myself say, like, I made this commitment. I was going to have all this progress in this next month, but I missed 2.5 weeks. Look at all and so I've lost this progress, and I'm sort of hard on myself for not having gotten there because I'm like, oh, I go play pickleball or I go do something, and I'm like, oh, I'm a little sore. Imagine how much less sore if I had just done those 2.5 weeks. I would have had all these gains. And so it's interesting that I'm hearing and I'm seeing myself grieving the loss that we spoke about. And I also see that if I can put that away, if I can actually just focus on, well, I'm today I just did it. Let me feel how good that feels. And if I can focus on that, it will lead me more to be able to do it the next day versus the other.
You're sounding very iterative as your main fuel that you're fueling, which is why you're able to keep going. But then there's these little catches of where you think you have to be performative. And what I would say is that if you held the performative aspect, which does, it's exciting. It's like jet fuel, performative stuff. It's like, ooh, there's a high at the end of it. If you do what you say you do and you get the results, or you win the race or that kind of thing. But then know that there's a lull, after the concert's over, after the rock star, and there's that big high or the awards show or whatever. That's when people underestimate the habenula is going to come on and do a -2 on you. And you got to be ready for that.
I think I have extra habenulas.
You do? You got extra? You grew some.
I do. This is a question you don't mention at all in your book. I want an entire book on it. I want you to talk about sex. Because this is an act that is, by definition, performative.
Yes.
And also
can be,
and also should be, ultimately and ideally, a true expression of you being yourself. And I'm thinking about, especially with hookup culture, right?
Yeah.
What is the habenula doing when you're having casual sex versus committed, connected sex?
So this is great. This is all very hypothetical. So I'll just say that up front. But,
It's my favorite kind of science.
When I was 30 with my first husband, I don't think I'm revealing anything. I outed myself that I had been faking orgasms. And
your habenula was faking orgasms.
Yes, your habenula was, you were performing, and then your habenula was like, this is not working out.
Oh my gosh!
And so I was tired of failing at orgasms. And I told him, and that just opened up a whole new world of like.
I mean, whose failure is it when you don't have an orgasm, doctor?
I know, but then,
but
then you're protecting the man's habenula if you're heterosexual, and so you're protecting your partner's habenula by acting not truthful. You're performing as a sexual being, and of course, with so much pervasive porn, which is an addiction, which is dopamine seeking, and then habenula is going to come right after that. So right after the masturbation, for men especially, that is the biggest surge of oxytocin that they get is post ejaculation, and so then you've got this like dopamine seeking thing. You've got the habenula punishing you in the negative direction. Look, you're lonely, nobody loves you, like. They're calling you afterwards, like all that kind of stuff comes into play. And so in hookup culture, you may be enjoying the dopamine in the moment, but the next morning, the reason why you feel so horrible is because the habenula is punishing you and that -2 thing that's doing. And then you want more. Then you want to go into more addiction.
Or you push it aside. Because I know a lot of people are like, I don't feel horrible, I feel amazing. There's a notion also of pushing that aside. Because if you look deeply and again, like there may be people who like to hook up with people. It's like not for me to say, but I'm thinking about in this scenario of if there's a loneliness behind it, if there's an emptiness, if there's a desperation, if there's getting involved in situations that are dangerous and you know it and you're putting yourself at risk, right? Like that's where your habenula is like, I'm at the party.
Yeah. And most people don't realize when they say, I'm fine, they're just remembering how good it felt to feel connected in that moment because they have this surge of oxytocin, which is stronger and more pervasive in terms of receptor sites than dopamine.
Is that always true of I'm fine? You're thinking back to when you were fine.
So maybe. But it's a story. It's not really how you're really feeling. Because I know this because I've talked to so many people in depth about their lives. It's kind of a whack-a-mole. Like if you're denying that about how you're feeling in this one domain of sex, then guess what? You're going to eat, or you're going to drink alcohol, or you're going to numb out in some other way, or you're going to look for the next hit. You're going to look for the next lover.
Okay, let's get back to you and your first husband because that's very interesting. I want to know.
I didn't consent him for this conversation.
No, but
we're good friends. But.
No, but my question is, once you've made that admission, right? Is that then a place that you get to say, I want to step into my authentic self, and I'm either not going to have an orgasm or it's going to become a priority for me and my habenula?
Oh my gosh, it just throws the gauntlet down, doesn't it, between you? Because then they have all kinds of habenula activity around like, well, this whole time I haven't been as good of a lover as I thought, so I'm failing as a lover.
Wow.
Right? And as a sexual partner. And then, men, especially, with erections, things that they're really sensitive around that. And so how do you then, I don't know what role it played in our divorce, but, 2 years later we got divorced. He had trouble with intimacy in general, so I think that there's just a whole other level of sex health that has not been accessed in any way because we are so busy performing either as porn stars or as people not telling our truth.
Right. That's what it is, right?
Yeah, there's so much inauthenticity in the sexual relationships with people.
It's really funny because I'm just going to go ahead. Never thought this episode would go here.
Me neither.
I've never in my life faked an orgasm. Ever, 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 ever.
Good for you.
And thank you. But I remember that when I would hear that women would do this, and you learn about it in magazines or something, and I was a late bloomer, for those of you playing bingo at home. I was a late bloomer, but I remember that when I heard that people did that, I was like, why would you make someone think something about themselves that they could do that just isn't true?
Wow.
Meaning it boggled my mind. And that's not to say that, I absolutely have the best sex life of any human on the planet, but I'm just saying that it never made sense to me. But it's interesting because in so many other aspects of my life, some might argue all the other aspects of my life, there is a very strong sense of how's the other person and what do they need? And am I making them happy? And my job as an actor is to make other people say, yes, you got the job. Exactly. So this was the one arena. It's the island of orgasm
Health.
Isolation.
Good for you. Good for you. You're
I've also
in the
never had an
minority.
orgasm. Is that? No, I'm just kidding.
But you're in the minority.
I guess, but like I said, it never made sense to me. And, I was a young, empowered feminist. Why would you make someone think that they succeeded in pleasing you if they didn't? Because then you're missing an opportunity to teach them what actually makes you feel good.
Now you're making me interested in polling feminists versus non-feminists and finding where that breaks.
Do you have a feminist habenula or not? That's the title of this episode.
Exactly.
Did your habenula have an orgasm last night?
What is the percentage of people who have faked orgasm? It sounds like you've done a little research in this space.
For women, it's the majority. And I don't remember it's been years since I've seen the actual numbers and it's not coming to me.
Let's touch on pornography for a moment and the impact that you see it having on people's feelings of authenticity versus feelings of shame.
When you think about performative versus authentic expression, there's a larger question to be had about pornography in terms of what impact it has on our ability to then either mimic in a performative sense, or is it a neutral way to get in touch with a variety of things that we're learning about? Is pornography impeding my ability to be my authentic self?
The very nature of seeing other people in a pornographic sense is not in itself harmful. I think that kind of like what we were talking about with the news, if I could make a weird analogy there, the porn industry is fueled by outrage. That they're competing with each other for, race to the bottom of the brainstem, as Tristan Harris calls it. And so it's an attention economy and it's set up to be an addiction economy.
I was just going to say, one of the components of sex addiction in this arena is the need to keep upping the stakes, which is, I think, also what that sort of proliferation in outrageous porn, is sort of getting harmful, abusive,
really damaging,
correct. But there's a notion of needing to sort of up the stakes, which addicts themselves don't always enjoy, meaning it's a compulsive machine.
That's right. And so, that hyperstimulation is always, kind of a reach for when your habenula's on and you don't know it's on, I think it just, it cannot be overstated that the habenula is doing this in a silent, quiet way. There's no ouch, my habenula's on. It's very secret, it's stealthy. And so in a person who's using porn as their drug to quiet their habenula, they're on that number line. 1 step towards dopamine pleasure, 2 steps pain. 1 step pleasure, 2 steps pain. So they're falling down into a hole where they've got to do more and more drug, the more and more rough drug and harsh drug and things like that in order to get to, yeah. And then, it's the same result. Iterate your way out of that, dopamine fast, whatever can get you out of that terrible, terrible state of helplessness and powerlessness against your addiction.
I can't help but think about things like chronic pain and things like, for those of us with autoimmune conditions, right? Where there's, for lack of a better word, iterative aches, pains, things. I'm a person who like my back will go out, twice a year and it's always the same thing. And it's the psoas muscle and like, it's the muscle of change, whatever. I'm like done changing. But I was thinking about the role of the habenula, because if we're talking about addiction, the brain is very redundant. It doesn't have as many communication pathways as there are pathways. So it is a redundant system. It uses a discrete amount of chemicals. It uses a discrete amount of receptors and channels and things that open and electrophysiological changes. So it's a very redundant system. But I'm kind of buying into this like holy grail component, because obviously there's never one thing in the brain that we can say. For some people, the habenula may be a really, really important hot point. And for someone else, it might be hypothalamic. It could be amygdala. Like it could be a lot of things. But when I think about addiction and I think about patterns and I think about, these grooves that our brain will go into, I can't help but think about things like chronic pain and things that we used to call psychosomatic illness. I mean, people used to be told it's all in your head. Then we shifted to psychosomatic, and now we're shifting into more of the Dr. Sarno conception of like the mind-body syndrome, right? So where does mind-body syndrome and sort of the intersection of your thoughts and your physiology, where does that play into the sort of patterns that the habenula is going to try and tap into as well?
Yeah, and this is a very recent study, like a week ago kind of thing, with rheumatoid arthritis and depression. And what they found is that habenula mediates the depression of rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
And mediates the rheumatoid arthritis. So there's something really intriguing about that. That of
also,
course,
what comes first, right?
Yeah. We don't have that all worked out. So that's the area where I think science is going to explode, is figuring out, chicken or eggs on those kinds of things, or even how the cycle gets started, and then also how to undo it.
Yeah, and Jonathan and I did a talk at South by Southwest on the intersection of science and spirituality. But a huge component of this was, it's very hard to know what comes first, right? Are people who are depressed, well, we know, and Gabor Mate has done, all this work, and Bessel van der Kolk, we know that people who have, let's say, adverse childhood experiences, children who witness trauma, children who experience trauma themselves, right? This is all setting the stage for, I would say, a habenula that is struggling, a limbic system that is on fire, right? An amygdala that doesn't know real from imagined, right?
Yeah.
So then you have this notion of those people are susceptible to autoimmune disorders, right? We talk about the personalities associated with multiple sclerosis, with epilepsy, that there's a personality that often, even with cancer, these are some of the hardest statistics. But it's really interesting because, and this is, for better or worse, this is where animal studies come in to try and figure out what is the mechanism. Is it the depression that is opening up to a range of autoimmune dysfunction? Is it the habenula that is compromised or that is, lacking appropriate connections, let's say, to other places?
Yeah.
But especially, I'd be fascinated to see if for things like chronic pain or things like these autoimmune conditions, I'm so curious where more research will lead in terms of the habenula's role.
Me too. And again, it gives me that image of, the camel with the little nose ring, the habenula is that little nose ring. It's so outpowered and undersized, but it is overpowering everything on it's honestly the most powerful behavioral control I've ever seen in my career.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
The title of your book is Unstoppable Brain. And I want to have an unstoppable brain, and I think a lot of people do. And I know it's hard to ask you to sort of like sum up, your book in a top 3 things. But if I were to say to you, I feel stuck, I feel whatever it is, depressed, unmotivated, I can't move forward, whether it's work, weight, fitness, relationships, What are the 3 things you would suggest that I do to go from a stuck brain to an unstoppable brain?
Yeah. So stop overperforming everything.
Hmm.
Right size performance where it is beneficial, and then don't go when it becomes a sharp object. Stop.
Wow.
The second is turn off the habenula by talking yourself out of or letting go of or doing anything you can to neutralize failure or prevent failure, failure thinking. And then the third one is iterate the shit out of your life. That's what people do that succeed long term. That if you look at any successful person in any domain, what's hiding in plain sight is the amount of iteration that person is using to do that superhuman thing.
I have kind of a rudimentary question, and I know that there's a lot of research and a lot more research coming out about the habenula. What happens if you just section out the habenula? What does behavior look like?
Yeah, I have no idea. So there's a medial and a lateral. We didn't get into this detail, but if this is okay. Medial and a lateral. And the lateral seems to be most operant when it's active in causing depression, et cetera, all the kind of psychic pain. The medial may be mitigating that. But it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and we've only got a few pieces on the board. So there's no way to tell exactly how those are parsed out yet. But I'll say that, there's even a more recent study that came out last week where they took mother mice, and they cut off their lateral habenula activity. And what they found is that they stopped mothering their pups. And so it's just so consequential that the different things that people are trying to see, how each of these parts of the habenula activate.
Dr. Kyra Bobinet, the book is Unstoppable Brain, the new neuroscience that frees us from failure, eases our stress, and creates lasting change. It's really been so great to talk to you. We covered so many things in the book, not in the book, but I highly recommend people get the book. It's a wonderful reference to have. There's so many sections that you can pull up when you're in a particular situation. It's really a wonderful book to have on your shelf in your mental health and neuroscience category. So it's really been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So, Jonathan, Dr. Bobinet predicted that we would look at the world totally differently now that we've spoken to her and learned about the habenula.
You now want to push my sled too.
I want to push your sled too.
Also, we can pull it. It's a dual direction sled.
I think what I found interesting about sort of her statement around that is that we can sometimes, I'm imagining even in work relationships and in personal relationships, and I mean, especially with our children, we can have performative expectations for other people. It's not just for ourselves. I was thinking about, parenting is like a whole other aspect. Like I want her to write a book about the habenula and porn, habenula and parenting, like all the things. I was thinking about how much of what we want for our kids is often what we think looks good, right? And so much of, I think, our culture lends itself to, almost adults acting like adolescents in terms of like, I want it to look good. I want it to look good for him. I want him to have the car he wants. I want her to have the shoes that she wants. Or, we're going to go into debt so that I can give them this trip that we can't afford. How much of our lives is this conflict between my performative self and what I think I should do so that I'll look a certain way versus my authentic self?
I think people have mostly been programmed not to even know what their authentic self is. How do we get to that in a modern day society where we're overrun with images of what other people are doing, what we think will make us happy? I see my son who's 16 now, and he's really into training for tennis, training for pickleball, but on YouTube Reels, he sees a lot of bodybuilders, and I see him comparing himself to these bodybuilders and looking at his traps and being like, do I have big traps? Am I broad? My friend has this muscle over here. How do I get that muscle? And in some ways,
tell him to look at his father. He's going to have the same exact body.
And in some ways, that information is available. When I wanted to lift weights, I had to go read Arnold's bodybuilding manual and flip through the pages. And now he has access to all of these different exercises at the tip of his fingers. But on the same regard, I'm like, how much of this is driven by his need to look good to versus have his body perform well in the activities that he's passionate about that motivate him. That's a slippery slope.
When we listed the performative tools that fail, so I just want to go over them real quick. New Year's resolutions, social media, sports goals, fitness trends, dieting, habit routines, to-do lists. Lying was one of them, career and relationship goals, and then those SMART goals, those specific kind of metrics goals. Jonathan, what is your most reliable performative tool that you might want to change?
I've really been working on being consistent with working out, and I'm trying really not to base that on any sort of metrics for visual appeal or building a type of muscle versus functional performance. Meaning, I know that to be healthy, to increase lifespan, as Peter Attia talks about, that building and maintaining muscle is super important. So instead of doing it I want to get jacked to look great for summer, I'm doing it much more so with the mindset to not have it be a sharp object if I do not execute 5 days a week or 6 days a week or lift this number of plates, but really iterating so that I know what exercises I can do that I can recover from, that I can stay consistent with. And if I do miss a day or if I'm not hitting it, that I'm not beating myself up for that.
I really like that. And I think that notion that it's not bad to have a habit. It's not bad to have a to-do list. It's not bad to have a career goal or a relationship goal, but it's all kind of about the framing. I'm also curious, Jonathan, if any of the types of failure, like the types of ways that we tend to sort of think about failure, if any of those were relatable to you. So the choices are all or nothing thinking. That's kind of my specialty. Comparing. I used to be able to. Pre-failing. Imposter syndrome. Nothing works for me. Been there, done that. Or shoulding. Like, I should have done this. He should have done that.
I can relate to shoulding for sure. Oh, I should do this and then I will have gotten that result. Imposter syndrome, when we first started this podcast, I didn't think I was going to have a microphone. Sometimes you ask me questions, I'm like, there should be a doctor or someone to speak to this. Who am I to say any of this? So I struggle with that for sure. Pre-failing, I have definitely thought about like, oh, is this worth it? Should I go down this path of like learning something or exploring an avenue? How much time, effort is that going to take? And trying to do mental gymnastics to try to think about the cost-benefit ratio.
I've had a handful of friends in my life where I can recall them dating someone who was really smart and charismatic and fun and seemed to be really ambitious, but had what they described as a fear of success as opposed to a fear of failure. But when I was looking at this list, the been there, done that is actually it's a way of being afraid of success because it's like, oh, I've already done that, or I don't need that. And I just thought it was kind of interesting because it's a component of this larger notion of a fear of failure. And, I think everyone can relate to one of these, if not more than one, right? But for me, the all or nothing thinking, or I used to be able to, right? Like I used to be more fit, or especially like as our bodies get older and especially as women, like I used to be able to do this. Why would I even try? I have friends who started running triathlons in, their late 30s and they were able to push past that, like nothing works for me. I know people who get in that ruminative, depressive, like, why should I try,
Actually, black and white thinking is a big one. I used to think things were much more binary. I can do this thing or I could do that thing, but they can't always fit together. Even when one of those two things that I would juxtapose, neither of them felt right. And what I've seen more and more is that often the solution is some combination. There's actually a joke when I'm presented two creative options. My answer is always, can we take a little bit of each of them? And there's a strategy amongst creatives where they'll give you two or three they'll give you the Goldilocks scenario. You take this option, you take the middle option, or you take the extreme option. And almost always I'm trying to blend things to create the ideal.
Well, I think that that's really the iterative mindset. And I thought that was interesting that she mentioned that there may be some gender differences in how people organize around the iterative mindset. But yeah, that's you kind of adding, right? It's you adding. That was one of the aspects, right? Inspiration, time, environment, reduce, add, togetherness, expectations, and swaps. I really do appreciate this new perspective. I don't know if it's going to make my brain unstoppable, but I definitely am going to try and incorporate more of this iterative mindset to be constantly trying. That's how I'm continuously trying. That's how I kind of feel like I'm going to take on the day.
If by unstoppable, she means an unstoppable jukebox with songs in your head, then you're already
I'm unstoppable today. Unstoppable. I'm unstoppable today. It's a Sia song. Unstoppable today. Unstoppable today.
Skip?
Oh, you want to skip? No, I'm not playing that game. From our breakdown to the one we hope you never have, we'll see you next time.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you. She's got a neuroscience PhD or two.